Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the 1947 Partition Archive. Given the critical situation South Asia is facing right now for the COVID-19 crisis, we are adding some new programming to our channel to answer your questions about the crisis. Today's topic will be mental health, the age approach. My name is Titash Biswas, and I'm volunteering to bring you this episode. Joining me is Sana Wasiq, who's a Fulbright scholar and a graduate from Teachers College, Columbia University. And she co founded Zaaviyah Mental Health Services along with Amna Chaudhry, who's a mental health therapist, co founder of Zaaviyah Mental Health Services. And she completed her MA in Applied Psychology with a focus on mental health counseling on the Fulbright Scholarship at New York University. So, welcome, Amna and Sana. And
Thank you.
so, shall I proceed with the questions?
Sure.
Sure.
So, how differently does the pandemic affect people belonging to marginalized communities, including women, children, and minority communities?
I'll just start by thanking you for having us here. I think it's a great initiative, and thank you for talking about these things. I think when we talk about marginalization, it's also important to first talk about how marginalization might manifest differently across contexts, right? So, marginalization can be in the form of religious minorities, gender minority, socioeconomic demographics, right? So even though on the surface, especially when this pandemic started, the understanding was that the disease doesn't discriminate, right? Like it's going to affect everyone in the way that it's supposed to attack the body and all of that. But when we talk about the sociological or the psychological perspective on this, we need to understand that it does discriminate in the form of how people are able to react to it or respond to it, right? So when we came with the guideline on social distancing, for instance, a lot of us had the privilege of doing that, working from home, taking time off from work. But then there were a lot of communities which did not have that privilege simply because they couldn't afford to take off from work, right? And those were the communities which were out there still working, maybe due to their socioeconomic background, maybe due to their occupational commitments, like healthcare workers. So that's one way in which marginalization in the form of economic deprivation can really affect people differently across classes. And even if you look at past epidemics, like Ebola, for instance, like the communities which are most vulnerable to economic crisis are actually the ones that suffer the most when something like a pandemic hits you, because there is a global economic crisis, right? So in this context, there is these groups might not be able to take a sick leave even if they are infected, and then there's the stigma attached to, oh, you're infected and you're still working. But things aren't that black and white, right? And that is something that is going to receive a lot of backlash, but that is because there aren't structures in place to support these groups to be able to adhere to the guidelines that are there to prevent the pandemic from spreading. Other groups might include, people who do not have access to knowledge in the same way as, the only access they have are maybe government messaging. And if your government is not investing in that messaging or is communicating wrong messaging or incorrect information, those are the groups that are most vulnerable because they might not have access to the internet to do their own research on it, or to have access to maybe WHO guidelines, right? And again, those are then the groups that are even more stigmatized, that, oh, they're not wearing masks, they don't know, they're the ones who are causing this to spread further. And so again, that is not because they don't want to prevent the disease, right? But it's because they don't know any better. And that's not on them, it's on the structures or the systems that are responsible for communicating these things. And that's why, like media messaging becomes so important, because for the masses, that's the only source of information. Similarly, you talked about, I think, women, right? So when we talk about women and men, I think there's a different impact happening due to different forms of marginalization. So I talked about the economic crisis, for instance. So it's actually shown that although women are more vulnerable to develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, when we have like a disease outbreak, but men are actually more likely to be exposed to PTSD simply because of the economic crunch, because they have the responsibility of managing a lot of households. And even though traditionally it's still there, right, we have things changing, but traditionally the economic pressure still lies, um, unfortunately, on the men. And that economic instability can actually cause trauma beyond the pandemic or the epidemic, simply because there's an aftermath. Once the economy shakes to that extent, there's an aftermath that still takes them time to maybe get another job, maybe to recover from losses that they incurred. But when we talk about women, there's a different form of marginalization that they experience because of the something called the multiple role conflict, where, again, like I said, traditionally men are still more burdened by the economic pressures, women are still more burdened by the household pressures. And that's where the patriarchal structures kind of come into play, and giving women burden of both the house and the job. And then with working from home, there's another layer of, okay, kids are also home, and you have to carry forward your career, or even if you're a homemaker, the duties are doubled, basically. I'm sorry, I'm hearing a lot of noise. Is that just me? No?
There is some minimal
Yeah.
noise. I think
Okay.
that's all right. Okay.
All right. Yeah.
So what we're talking about here is that the traditional role of, the kind of division of labor that we see reflecting in families and households in South
Mm-hmm.
Asia and most countries, it still remains, and it's intensifying during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, like I was mentioning there, that I'll talk about the multiple role conflict again here, because women are still largely responsible for emotional labor. Women are still largely responsible for domestic labor. And this is true whether women are working women or homemakers, right? Because there's a dual responsibility going on. So I let Sana talk more about the homemaker aspect of it, but I'll focus more on working women, right? So what we noticed, especially with COVID, because we had the opportunity to work from home due to the technological advances that we have access to now, but women found themselves buried in work from working on their jobs, but also managing all of the household chores, even though a lot of men were also working from home. But because there's this like assumed responsibility that, okay, you are going to also now take care of the family while you are working on your laptop and working on your report or whatever you're working with, right? And if you talk about more nurturing jobs like psychotherapists or teachers, they're not only consuming that emotional toll from their students or from their clients, but also then, making sure that people in the household are emotionally regulated, right? And I'm not just talking about children, but like parents, in-laws, husband, you name it, like any kind of relationship that you find at home, women ended up with that responsibility. And that also meant, in some cases, unfortunately, there was also a rise in domestic violence, right? So that is also a consequence of the pandemic, which affected women more so than men. And all of this comes down to, again, the lack of understanding that just because you are transitioning to a home environment does not mean that the woman no longer has the job, right? So when we talk about, even if you just like talk to people, you will notice that if a man is having a meeting, be it like your brother or your son or whatever, everyone's going to be quiet. Everyone's just going to be like, don't make a noise because he's on his Zoom meeting. But when a mom is on their Zoom call, like there's the children like coming in the background, or it's like your sister is on the call, there's like, oh, he's just working for pleasure, even though that's not the case. So, and for healthcare workers, for instance, who didn't have that privilege of working from home, they weren't given any access to daycare services to have their children who are now home be taken care of. They were expected to come into work with children at home and doing that duty even though they were not at home. Tony, you want to talk about like homemakers?
I think Amna touched upon, I think, mostly all the aspects of it, because when we're looking at this layer, which we've kind of developed, when we're talking about working professionals and also homemakers at the same time, I think all of that still applies to homemakers at the same time.
Yeah.
It was, an increase in unpaid labor at all times, childcare, be it your spouse, be it your relationships at home. A lot of people faced having no servants around this time because people were getting sick all over. It kind of increased all the labor that a woman was already doing by tenfolds. So technically, all the things that Amna said for working professionals, it all applies to homemakers by tenfolds, because it was at the same time them doing all the chores all by themselves. So I think we don't necessarily need to take up more time by just talking more about homemakers, because I think it just kind of is very much the same with the layer of working professional attached there or without it.
I would just add that even when we talk about homeschooling, right?
Yeah.
I haven't heard, I mean, I'm sure there are exceptions, but I haven't heard of fathers being involved in like sitting with their kids for Zoom classes. I mean,
Right.
But there are mothers who are trying to teach their children how to write, and they don't know, they aren't trained in that, but they took on that role.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think being on a lot of mom groups kind of made me realize that there were so many moms out there who didn't know how to use Zoom. And then moms who had their work at the same time as the kids at their school had to put grandmothers or grandfathers or whoever was in the house available to do the task for them and learn Zoom. So it was an overall like a family system, everybody trying their best to learn electronic and, just online systems as a whole. So I think it was just generally everybody kind of playing a role to help the women out there.
Definitely.
So how do you think the pandemic is affecting different kinds of women according to the kinds of labor they're associated with contributing? I'm asking this question because we were just talking about, how women who work at home, their workload has increased like 10 times over or more because now they don't have any domestic help. What about the people who come to our houses and help us with domestic labor, like the maid servants or women belonging to disadvantaged economic backgrounds?
Tana, you want to take that on?
I think for them, most of them probably had no system in their houses. When a woman steps out of the house, I guess a lot of us still had our servants coming in, our helps coming in to support us through this time, because they also had to get their houses running. That's the way that they run their roti, chula, whatever. Unka khana pina is based on this money that they get from us. So I think if financially it would have been very taxing for these people had they not come to work. Us, fortunately, or there's a very big privilege attached to that we, even though we were working from home, like Amna said earlier on, we still had the opportunity to still get our pays on time. For a lot of people, they didn't have that.
Yeah.
So other jobs due to the pandemic. And I think that happened with a lot of people who were on daily wages. So a lot of these people we're talking about who belong to the lower socioeconomic strata didn't have work anymore. People who, the rediwalas, people who are selling ice cream on just a van. All these people, they lost their jobs. So, to look at it, this was a big economic crisis for the lower economic status than, the middle class or the upper middle class. So yeah, I think it was, there wasn't, again, any system in place as far as as far as the South Asian context is concerned. But I think because we're such a collectivist culture, one thing that I did see happening was that a lot of people would put up social media posts telling we know someone who's in need of help, going through a financial crunch. They still have to pay for their kids' education if they're going to school, if they're going to colleges, if they have something coming up. The pandemic wasn't easy on health crisis either. It was a lot of people needing a lot of support medically, psychologically, physically. And I think that's where the collectivist culture came in. That's at least what I noticed or observed. And I think a lot of people then, just jumped in to support these people who needed the support. And I think that's a great thing about the South Asian culture in general, which probably does not extend to a lot of other cultures.
So what about children? Are children able to grapple the kind of nuances that are imposed on our social psyche by a crisis like the pandemic?
Right. I think I'd like to divide this question into three parts. Are they able to grapple? Yes. Are they able to cope? I mean, they had to. Did they have an option there? And number three, did they feel less impacted or were they not affected? Of course not. Everybody was. I think as far as Amna was talking about adults in the initial, first question, everybody was so impacted by this pandemic. And needless to say, kids were too. Sometimes we feel kids are very young when we're talking about toddlers or children under the ages of 10. We feel oh, how would they understand? How do they know the nuances of the pandemic? What's why should they? But at the same time, they're walking, talking human beings who are learning things from day one. They know what's happening around them. School closures happened. They couldn't socialize. They couldn't go to playgrounds. They couldn't go to any fun areas. Couldn't meet their friends, family. Couldn't travel at all. Those who were had the privilege to travel. So everything just shut down. Imagine the world shutting down, and your only kind of sense of identity is when you socialize with others. As human beings, we are social beings. We are by default in a place where we want to socialize. We want to get to know people. That's how we do things throughout the days. So I think when everything closed down for them, automatically they've had to learn to cope with things. And I think a big role is usually schools are playing that role for the children when they're teaching a lot to them, and then schools close down. There was online education that they had to shift to completely. So I think there's a huge shift from the real self to this online self. And a lot of kids, of course, had a lot of struggle during this time as well, but a lot also learned a lot of new ways to just learn to live this new life that they had to. So yeah, I think since everything halted for everybody, kids were probably in the same boat as all of us.
I think we often tend to forget that, like you said, children are walking, talking human beings. I think a lot of people just assume that, oh, they're just doing their own thing,
kids.
but actually they're pretty sensitive to a lot of things that are going on around.
Absolutely.
What about, say, adolescents or young adults? Is it different for them, the situation?
When we're talking about, I think for adolescents and young adults, things were pretty rough as well, because if you look at a family systems approach here, everybody was navigating this family space together after a very long time. Never, probably, I don't know in the history that all the entire world had to go into the vicinity of their homes only. This was the first time when, at least in my life, at least that's what I experienced, was that everybody was in the same place at the same time. Fathers who were working were home, moms who were working or not working were home, kids who were working or not working, or studying or not studying, jobs or no jobs, everybody was home. So I think there was a huge impact on adolescents and young adults as well at the same time. For those who just started the universities, for instance, had to go on an online semester for the longest time. I mean, I have cousins who probably have started university but still haven't experienced what a university actually looks like or feels like because they haven't been to one yet. And a lot of kids who started school, or like, people who were in the middle of like, shifting schools, shifting, cities or even countries, probably haven't had the chance to get to know their immediate environments as yet, because like, we've been in this place for probably almost 2 years.
And also, like, if we look into even previous epidemic where we have more research there, right? The younger population, that's when I was talking about adolescents and young adults, are actually one of the most vulnerable groups
Impacted, yeah.
anytime that an infectious disease epidemic breaks out. And that's because they're, like Kana said, they're not only adjusting to college life, but that's also a form of structure that they have in their life. And those who are, for instance, about to graduate in their senior years and are trying to look for a job, they enter a job market where there isn't much stability. And that can actually cause a lot of anxiety, more than we anticipate, because that's already a time of a lot of anxiety in normal circumstances. So think about graduating at a time where you just don't know whether you will be employed for a year, maybe. So definitely, I think the research also backs this up, that this is actually one of the most vulnerable groups during such a outbreak.
I think it's also the time where, like, what most children, adolescents, and young adults are looking for in their life is structure,
Yes.
some sort of like predictability, like, oh, I will be able to do things in this X amount of time, and it doesn't happen then. And then structure, which is so essential for all of us, having a routine. And like, all the routine was disrupted during this time as well. And then a sense of security. Am I safe enough wherever I am? And like, having the safety net, like Amna was talking about, having the idea that, oh, I will be employed, as soon as like I graduate. I'm like a great student and I did all of this, amazing stuff in college, and now, like, where's my job?
Yeah.
So how should adults try to understand the degree of sensitivity that children, adolescents, young adults seem to go through during a crisis as deep as the pandemic?
Right. I think the first and foremost thing here to do would be that understand and recognize as adults that everybody is going to have a varied response or reaction to this pandemic. So for a lot of children that I worked with in my private practice, there was one thing that definitely I need to point out before I say that, is that there was an extreme influx of clients during this last 1 year, especially. Amna and I both noticed that our practices were like, we were like maxed out, and we didn't have spots because it was so difficult. This time for everybody was so difficult, and we had a lot of clients coming in. So probably it kind of shows that a lot of people were struggling. A lot of children were struggling. A lot of adolescents were struggling. Young adults, everybody was struggling a lot. So I think we need to realize that kids, recognizing that kids can be emotionally vulnerable too. And I think the major caregivers in our lives probably are our parents. And then, like, when we're going to an institution like school or college, that's our teachers or professors there. So I think there's a huge role that they come and play here. And that's where, like, empathy comes in as well. Like Amna said earlier on, we talked about how they're walking, talking humans, but we somehow kind of take them for granted. We don't necessarily see them as people with emotions as well. A lot of times we'd say things, sentences, words to our children, even not recognizing how deep an impact it can have on their psyche. So, like, something like, if a child is crying, we often say, like, stop crying, rona band karo, koi rone ki zarurat nahi hai. So, I mean, if
कुछ
a
भी नहीं
child is
हुआ.
crying, kuch bhi nahi hua. So, like, अगर रो रहा है या रो रही है, so I'm sure there is something happening for them to feel so emotionally overwhelmed that they have to express it in terms of crying. I mean, it's okay for them to cry. So recognizing, empathizing if they're feeling something, and then try to do these 3 R's that I read somewhere, and it was reassurance, telling them that they're safe, giving them this sense of safety and belonging, that they have a family with them, they have a support system, a network for themselves. Uh, B was routine. Routine is when a child has this sense of like predictability, like we said earlier, knowing that, I will have a structure in place. This is how my day is going to look like. Even if there is online school, even if the world is shutting down, I still have my routine to follow, which is I'll wake up in the morning, I'll do this next, then I'll have online school, then I'll have this, then I'll have my playtime. A structured playtime is very important, even when you're at home for children. Then, like, doing something creative with your children, spending some time talking about the pandemic, what their experience is like with them, and then, like, moving on with the day with the routine. And then regulation is very important for any age group, be it adults. We all need to be emotionally regulated, especially during this time, because uh, this is when we all had a high of emotions all across. Was it whether it was being sad, whether it was being worried, whether it was being like frustrated, angry, like all sorts of negative over influx of emotions was felt during this time by all of us. I think Amna and I as well, like we talk about days where we were having these uh, ups and downs
Yeah.
with our own moods as well. Even working in the field, even knowing that, like, oh, we're therapists, like we should know how to cope with it, but we were acknowledging that we were going through this hard time as well. So,
Yeah.
just acknowledging, and then if there is a need, please take professional help for your children. Don't take their mental health for granted. Don't think that this is gonna pass, they'll be fine, this was nothing. If your child is consistently, consecutively showing behaviors or something that seems off to you as a parent or a caregiver, take professional support.
I'll just add here that I know you talked about parents, but even with teachers, I did notice that just
Oops, there is probably an
Yeah,
electricity situation.
we lost Amna there for a
Yeah,
while.
I think she'd be back in a minute because that's how long it takes for her to get her power running if she loses it.
Okay.
At least that's my experience. So,
So
do we want to move on or do we want to wait for Amna?
I think we want to move on, and then she can take up when things
All
get
right. So,
settled there.
so I think I'd just give some more pointers here for the same question. One thing, so when I was talking about behaviors and taking your kid to a professional or your child to a professional, something that often comes up for parents is, what are some signs or symptoms that we have to be on the lookout for if
Mm-hmm.
we think or support. So, a few symptoms that are out there, and of course, we're not diagnosing our child with anything if they have these symptoms, because they're absolutely normal to have during this time. We're just saying if they happen in for a longer period of time, and if you feel like, even after the pandemic is over and this goes on for a very long time, which is an extended period, means months up to a year, and you feel like your child is not kind of going to the pre-COVID time, or like they're not feeling that normalcy again in their life, that's when we need to take them for help. So one could be like, your child gets very clingy, they're crying a lot, they're throwing a lot of tantrums all the time. There is a loss in their appetite or sleep. They're unable to socialize, form supportive friendships, form lasting bonds. They appear to be very sad all the time, engrossed in their own thoughts, and they don't want to go out. They don't find pleasure in all the activities they did before. So, like, playing is something that they don't enjoy anymore. Maybe going out to a park is something that they might not want to do again. Feelings of like stress or anxiety, if you feel like your child is being very panicky, if somebody's coming to see them, if somebody's coming to meet them. And so yeah, basically all of these. And like, also be on the lookout of like, if you see any marks on your child, if your child is self-harming. So there has to be a definite conversation about that as well, because there were a lot of cases that came up during this pandemic, and I'm giving a trigger warning here, that there was a lot of cases where kids would come in, or parents especially would come in and talk about their child self-harming. So of course, this is a very, very difficult conversation, even for parents sometimes. But I am more happy when parents can notice it than when it goes unnoticed. So even though it's a very difficult conversation for families, but I think it is great if it comes to light and we can talk more about it.
The signs and symptoms that you were talking about, they're also applicable for adults, right? Um, Signs of depression
Right.
and self-harm. Yeah.
Absolutely. Right. So these are all also signs and symptoms that we notice mostly in anxious clients or depressed clients. These are overarchingly, overlapping symptoms. I'm not going to go into the details of what depressive symptoms look like for depression's diagnosis or anxiety's diagnosis, because in our field of work, my degree is such that we don't work with the diagnosis. We work with like a model of these are some symptoms that we're looking at, and we're going to give like a appropriate treatment plan or intervention plan to the client. So my work doesn't work with diagnosis, not nor does Amna's work. So that's something that we keep in mind, that we'll have a working model there, but we're not necessarily diagnosing anybody. However, if we see that there is any need for a person who's going through all these symptoms and they need additional support, we might bring in a psychiatrist in the loop and refer them to somebody who could then give them a medication if needed.
Okay, so therapy comes in before medication is prescribed.
So a lot of people have very different views around that. Some people would want to go into therapy first because they're not very pro medication and they'd want to see how therapy works out for them, and then going into psychiatry or like taking a medication, as we said. But for some people, they'd be like, oh, I think medication might work better for me. So let me take this medication first. And I don't want to do talk therapy, so I'm not going to go to a therapist. It doesn't make sense to talk out your feelings because who cares? This is not going to help us out. So they're people who have these varying opinions, but then there are a few who believe in the combination of two, which is great. And there is a lot of efficacy around that as well. A lot of people can get a lot of help if they are in treatment therapy and also at the same time taking medical support if they need the two at the same time.
Right. So welcome back, Amna. Do you want to take up where you left it at?
Yeah, I was just talking about teachers, I think.
Yeah.
And yeah, sorry about that. So I was just saying that I've noticed in a lot of teachers that this dialogue has been said so many.
Oh
Oh
no.
no, she had a power failure again. Usually this doesn't happen, but I guess
This
happening today.
is, yeah. Okay. All right. So let's move on with the other questions.
All right.
You're, yeah. So what about people, who cannot readily access mental health care? Let's see.
Right.
What about them?
So for people who can and for people who cannot, um, I think this question sort of makes sense, but at the same time, I feel like even people who have access to mental health care uh, cannot get well or do not get okay overnight. So there is when people don't have mental health access, uh, it's of course it's really 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 rough for them. They do not have any way to get support for themselves. They do not know where to go, how to cope up, don't have any coping mechanisms in place. They don't necessarily know what the symptoms really look like. How can they recognize, how can they pick up these symptoms, and how can they really work on themselves? But at the same time, when we're looking at people who do have access, even for them, it is a process. It does not happen, like I said, overnight. This is not an overnight change. A lot of people, when they sign up for therapy, even, they ask us, how many sessions would we need? And to that, my answer is, as long as you need it for. So sometimes people are looking at the end goal, which is how long do I need it for? Of course, this is a very emotionally taxing process. It is financially taxing as well. It brings up a lot of vulnerabilities for a lot of people as well. So we absolutely understand people coming into therapy as well. They're putting a lot on the plate as far as emotions are concerned. So we know it's a lot for them. But at the same time, um, you know, sorry, I just lost my train of thoughts there. But when I was talking about access and overnight changes, even therapy takes a long time. It takes a long time to have these internal shifts that we want to have, because sometimes people could work on very surface level things like uh, my I don't like this certain person at work, or sometimes kids would come in and say, like, this kid is bullying me. So they could, like, talk about these surface level changes, and do have these surface level changes in their life as well. But at the same time, maybe they're not having those internal shifts. So maybe when they have the same situation again, in a few months time again, they go through the same symptoms, they go through the same experience of it again. So it really varies with people who even have access, and then those who don't. I think Amna, let's just jump to this question and maybe pick one from here.
I'm just like, it's okay, rolling with the
No,
punches.
it's okay. So we're
Yeah.
talking
Yeah,
about, like, people who have
yeah.
access to mental health,
Mhm.
and then
Right.
those who, like, don't have access. So
Mhm.
I said a few lines there, but if you want to take on from here.
Well, let's hope I don't get disconnected again. But I think that question is really interesting, and I'm not sure what Sana has already covered, but it's important to recognize that everyone might experience the pandemic differently, right? So most common symptoms are anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and depression, right? So those are the most commonly prevalent mental health concerns seen during a pandemic. When we talk about people who don't have access to mental health resources, I think they're impacted in the similar manner initially. So people who have access to resources versus who don't. But the difference is that once you start going to treatment, yes, it might take some time, but over time you might learn certain managing or coping techniques. Whereas people who don't have those resources or are just hesitant in reaching out for help. Um, the dif-
My
Oh no,
um
I think we lost. I think Amna was somewhere on a similar page with me, I think.
mhm.
But I think
Yeah, she
maybe,
was. Yes, please go ahead. You're saying
so
something.
I think that's exactly what I think she was bringing up as well, that with people who don't have access, or who have access and don't take up that opportunity to get themselves in therapy or get mental health support for themselves, I think, I mean, it's very unfortunate if they don't. And I think if they do have that access and they're still denying themselves that opportunity, I'd say I'd really, really encourage them to get that support if they think they can, financially or emotionally invest in it. It's great, not because I'm a mental health professional myself, so I'm selling my profession there, but I think it is great because I think I've also been in the client's seat, and I know that it's a very overwhelming process, but at the same time it's a very emotionally rewarding, I'd say, process as well. So yeah, if you're, like, someone who's struggling out there because of the pandemic or anything else that is related with the pandemic but has impacted you in some way, and you think you have supports around you, I would really, really encourage for everybody to get that support and see how it works for them. So, like, test the
Right.
waters out. It may work for you, it may not work for you, but what is there to lose? Like, just give it a shot.
So, how has the pandemic come to affect family systems as a whole?
Right. I think we were talking about it earlier on as well. Like, when I mentioned a little bit about family systems, I think this was the first time when I said, like, everybody's in one place together, you know, uh, and I think in a collectivistic culture like South Asian culture, I think one thing that kind of becomes very evident during this time, or became evident for a lot of people, because I saw a lot of, like, I've also joined a lot of social media, like, groups as well. And I often go on there just to notice what the trends are for people, what kind of, like, struggles they're going through, what is the general concern of the general public as well. So kind of getting an idea from there as well, I noticed one thing, and that was the lack of boundaries in our South Asian culture as a whole. So when we look at a lack of boundaries, it could look like, a child at home trying to navigate the space with the other people in the house living with them. So it could be like a joint family system, or children who are living in a building, an apartment complex, and they have to like navigate the space with so many other kids living in the same apartment building as well, and sharing the resources of that building together. It could be a father at home, and like Amna pointed out, it is easier for men to like, find working spaces even within their home, because, oh, dad is working, so, stay quiet, don't be too loud. Whereas like, for a mom, if she's working, or a child who has a job, and like, a young adult who's just found a job and he's working. There was a meme going on around the past few days where like a guy is working on the computer, and the mom keeps coming in and says, खाने में क्या खाना है, roti paki hui hai, chawal khane hai ki roti khani hai. So like, things like these where boundaries are constantly like, being checked, and being questioned by people living and sharing the same space as you. So I think that is something that came up a lot. For a lot of people, there was a loss of financial resources as well. A lot of people lost their jobs because of the pandemic. And there was a change in their expenses, there was a change in what income they were getting. So there was like, this disparity kind of challenged a lot of family systems as well, and it was a cause of like, maybe conflicts within the family as well. At the same time, I think Amna mentioned it earlier as well, like we saw like an increase in domestic violence, and then kids having to experience that conflict between the parents as well. And when we're talking about like, the conflict in parenting, I think this was also the first time that both parents were in the same vicinity, and then one was being challenged by the other, and children were finding it hard to kind of like, navigate their way through that parenting, this new sort of parenting that was happening for them at the same time. So yeah, and I think another huge thing that was happening during this time was because of the pandemic's impact on health. There were so many people who got sick during this process. I also had my own parents get sick during this time. There was a very, it took a huge emotional toll on me as well. And then to only imagine people who lost their family members and the grief process that came along with it, I think that was also a very, very difficult time for a lot of family systems out there. And I think when we're talking about all these things, uh, not to forget the socialization process that we were like, completely taken away from, which led to like, feelings of frustration, anger, not being able to, meet friends, meet family. And all of these I'm gonna just like, put in one huge category of like, maybe the bad impact that COVID had on family systems. uh, Not to say like, it didn't have any good impacts. I think for some families it worked really well for them. It was a good time for them to be in one space together, gelling together, finding family support together. This was first time for a lot of kids to have their fathers like, usually traditionally we see that the role of the father is that he's working away from home for most part of the day. So like it was a good time for them to like, come out as a whole, as a family, together as well. And I think it kind of also made us very resilient, being
Yeah.
able to like, cope with life. I mean, like Amna said, rolling with the punches. I think we all tried our best to like learn that during this time. I think this is why maybe she was
Yeah.
happy today, because we've all become so resilient with this.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to take this opportunity to talk about how I actually also teach, and and online classes meant a lot of our students didn't have access to internet, didn't have access to stable electricity, and that obviously impacted their academics and their general sort of engagement with their peers. But also it's also been a point of friction within the family, right? Because for instance, a lot of teachers started dumping more work on the students because, oh, you're at home, but at the same time the family is expecting that, oh, because you're at home, you're now going to spend more time with us because your studies are just a part of your life, even though that's basically your entire life when you were a student. And people who are experiencing power outages like I just did during a presentation, that can also be, that can, throw you off of your confidence generally when you're at that age and stage. And that can also be a point of friction with the parents, in terms of parents who maybe are not, like Sana said, financially stable enough to endure, getting maybe a generator, especially in the South Asian context where load shedding is such a part of life. So these are little things which I think pile up and do affect the individual, but also their relationships within the vicinity that they're in. And a lot of kids who might have had shelter in, say, like a hostel, college hostel or school hostel, and didn't really get along with their family, were suddenly at, the whim of, okay, you're going back for spring break, but you just never came back. They were stuck in, some of them were stuck in abusive households, and that has been a very big struggle for a lot of young adults as well.
So, with the COVID numbers getting lower now, how can we reintegrate ourselves and instill a sense of normalcy, if that's possible?
Sana, you're mute.
So I think not only was this like a physical challenge for all of us, it was like a mental challenge for all of us, a psychological challenge to be in this time. So when we're talking about readiness, it's just not going to be physical readiness that we're looking at. We also want to look at the psychological readiness of everybody who was impacted during this process. So first off, retraining our minds again for this sense of safety and comfort. Uh, talking about it, recognizing that we went through a really hard time, accepting that these were our difficult experiences during COVID, and acknowledging all of these things at the same time. This is going to kind of be like a shift in our mindsets once more, because it was pre-COVID mind, and then COVID mind, and then I want to look into like a post-COVID mind that kind of looking at reintegration. I want to have some parts of my pre-COVID self, but I also want to maybe have some parts of my resilient self that I've learned during this time. So and then the next step would be going at your own pace, because everybody might be reintegrating at a very different pace than you would. So some people might somebody wrote on the social media the other day that they wanted to they thought as soon as they're going to get vaccinated, they're just going to be out there, attend all the parties in town, do whatever they wanted to do during this time that they couldn't do. And now suddenly when they have the vaccination, they still don't feel ready. And it's okay if you don't feel ready. Go at your pace, reintegrate at your own pace. If you have to be selective in saying yes or no to people, even if they're inviting you, asking you to join them over for a meeting or like a cup of coffee even, if you have to say no, say no. Recognize what your mind is telling you, recognize what you're ready for emotionally and physically, and then sign up for something. This process, during this process, sometimes we feel restrictions are over, SOPs in place, everything is great, we need to be happy now. But it's not necessary. The reintegration process a lot of times would look like you feeling very anxious even after getting a shot, the vaccination itself. It could look like you're still very scared. So feel all right with having multiple emotions, whether it's happiness, whether it's anxiety. And at the same time, be cautious, be positive, but be cautious, still follow SOPs. um,
Yeah.
just try to be as safe as you can, but also try and reframe your mind around all these things. Amna, if you want to add something here.
Yeah, I think that a lot of us have started talking about COVID in the past, but I think it's also important to remember that the pandemic is still ongoing. It might be lesser of a spread or infectious disease rate, like spread rate might be going down, but it's still very much there. People are still dying. People are still getting infected. A lot of the vaccinations might not result in complete immunity, right? So all of these things are still there. We still have to wear our masks, and when you are out there wearing a mask, um, it's difficult to pretend that everything is normal, because it's still not. Maybe in the States, like the ban has been lifted, but we are far behind, right? And we still have a massive proportion of the population that is refusing to get vaccinated, or we don't have enough vaccinations to cover them. So if you have anxiety around COVID, because even if you're vaccinated, don't label it as paranoia, because paranoia would be something which doesn't exist and you're being anxious about it, but this is very much still there. So it's okay to feel that way, and for people who don't feel that way, we're very comfortable. I think it's important for you to create that space for people who are anxious, right? Because it's never good to shame someone for being too cautious because they're worried about their own life, right? So I think it's important for us to give each other that space, like Sana said, to go at our own pace with all of this.
Right. So a lot of it is about not invalidating your own crisis, not invalidating others' emotions, and giving space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
How should women in particular engage in self-care during the pandemic?
So, like when we were talking about women specifically, we talked about how they might be taking on more roles and might be emotionally burned out, right? So, I think one of the main things that women need to start advocating for themselves, and again, I'm not saying this will be possible for every woman, but given in your own context, starting to set boundaries. And when I talk about boundaries, I don't necessarily mean nothing, but maybe you know picking battles that okay, I am going to help you with this, but maybe not after 8 p.m. when I just want some time for myself, right? Or maybe negotiating like a workspace within your own household, that okay, this is my space and I would like that kids don't come in here, or that you knock before coming in, which is again something very difficult in our collectivist culture, because boundaries are still a little blurred. Parents get offended if you ask them to knock before coming into your room, right? That itna bhi kya hai that you're not letting me come in. So picking your battles in the sense that okay, I can give in to you coming into my room without knocking if you only do that in these hours. So setting those boundaries are good. The other thing is, which not just for women but generally for all of us, we get so overwhelmed with either our work or our relationships, or other aspects of ourselves which consume us emotionally, that we kind of don't pay attention to things that make us feel a little bit of joy, right? So identifying a routine or maybe a ritual that really helps you, that could be, if you really enjoy having, I don't know, chai in the morning and you really enjoy it, making sure that you take out those 15-20 minutes every morning to just have chai, right? So that is very important because it allows you to engage with your own self and connect with your own self. A lot of us don't even, if I ask you that, okay, what is that one thing that you really find joy in, you might not be able to give me an answer right away, because sometimes we don't even think about, what makes me happy. And again, that becomes even more amplified within our own culture, South Asian context, because we're so focused on our relationships and giving other people joy. So I think taking that time to reflect on, what makes me feel happy. And the other thing is, for women specifically, seeking support with other women. I think that, a lot of us grow up on this idea of that, I'm not like other girls. I'm, those other girls are, do this or do that, and kind of being pitted against each other from a very young age. And especially if you go into like a male dominated field like the corporate sector, or STEM fields where there are already, very few women, we do end up trying to prove that we can outshine those other women. And the same thing happens when we are talking about homemaking, that okay, I'm a better mother, I'm a better sister. I think that we need to start changing and challenging that narrative and try to kind of form a community within ourselves and start leaning on each other rather than going against each other. I think my support system that comes from my friends who are women is far more nurturing and supportive than any other support group that I have, and that's true for a lot of women. And you might not get along with all the women out there, but find your clique. And I think because we share certain experiences based on our gender, especially
Absolutely.
within our culture again. And it's important to find that support system where you can find that validation. Those are just some of the things that I would say, pandemic or no pandemic. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, how should we attempt to feel, to understand the crisis of people belonging to different backgrounds and who have had, very different experiences of oppression?
I think something to understand here is that, of course, empathy plays a really big role in that, and empathy doesn't necessarily mean putting yourself in other people's shoes, but being in your shoes and trying to relate to what another person is experiencing. But I would just bring in the concept of intersectionality here. For instance, if I say that, okay, I am a woman and these are my experiences, and I've never been harassed, and so these women who are talking about harassment, they're just making that up, for instance. And I've heard this happen, right? Because a lot of people base things on their own experience and don't try to relate to another
Yeah.
person's experience. So when we talk about intersectionality, the concept basically talks about how me as an individual have different facets within my own identity, right? I am a woman, I'm South Asian, I'm Muslim, I belong to a certain socioeconomic class, and all of those together will shape my experiences differently in different contexts. So if we could just step back a little and start viewing people within their own context and trying to understand that, okay, so I don't have that experience, but let me just listen to what this other person is saying, and I might not fully understand, I might not fully relate, and I might not even be fully able to understand the extent of oppression that this person has faced. But can I just for a moment take their word for it and understand their lived experience from what they are telling me, right? And that takes a lot of practice because we have a lot of biases within ourselves. And I heard someone say this, and I truly believe that it holds true, that the second we start feeling that I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, that's when we stop challenging certain internalized biases that we have, and we stop our journey to like improving or picking up on things. I could tell Sana that, okay, yes, you are a mental health therapist, but you invalidated this person. But if Sana is coming from a place of, what, I've done my master's in this, so I know this, that's when she'll stop listening to any feedback, right? So I think always recognizing that there's more room for improvement, more room to learn from other people from their experiences, instead of getting defensive that, oh, I'm not like this, right? Being open to that dialogue is, I think, something that opens that door to understanding other people's experiences.
So, thank you so much, Sana and Amna. It was a pleasure having you here. And I hadn't mentioned this in the beginning, but Sana is someone who has worked with the UNICEF and School Education Department Punjab, where she trains school staff to help students deal with stress in relation to the pandemic. And Amna works with clients in the age range of 20 years and above, so right on point with young adults. And in this capacity, Amna is also working on research interests, including understanding the interplay of intersecting identities with psychological mechanism of trauma and shaping the perception and often response to traumatic experiences. So it was great having you guys here
Thank
today.
Thank you
you.
so much, and thank you for being so patient with all of the stuff.
Yeah.
I should have been saying that, but okay.
But no, this was actually great. Thank you for having us. I didn't say it earlier because Amna already said it. I thought I wouldn't take up your meeting's time here. So thank you so much for having us.